Our next speaker is Dr. Adrienne Caughfield. Dr. Caughfield, I haven't seen you yet. Are you here? Okay, thank you. Dr. Caughfield teaches United States and Texas history at Collin College in Plano, Texas. Her areas of interest are American expansion and exceptionalism. Her doctoral dissertation for TCU dealt with women's perceptions of expansion and manifest destiny in Texas prior to the Civil War. It also introduced Dr. Caughfield to the works of Mary Austin Holley. That dissertation was published by Texas A&M Press as True Woman and Westward Expansion. Dr. Caughfield will talk about Mary Austin Holley's Emigrant's Guide to Texas. Please welcome her. Forward, backwards,
and laser pointer. Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, first of all, to the GLO for allowing me to come and speak today. Between two beautiful flags, and I've never felt this official in my entire life. But as you said, we're going to be talking a little bit about Mary Austin Holley. Some of the stuff we're going to be talking about, I think, actually bookends pretty well with what we heard with Dr. Torgett in particular, since Stephen F. Austin was, of course, her cousin. So it'll be interesting to look at a slightly different perspective, kind of go with it together. So in the early days of the Republic, Americans expressed enthusiastic patriotism for their country in a lot of different ways. Part of that enthusiasm for its growth and its increasing strength mirrored a push for growth that was very similar to that amongst its citizens. And they're looking for ways for how they could draw some of that prosperity into new territories. Now, some of those were not yet in the United States. Obviously, we're looking at Texas here. In the early 1830s, many would be looking to the northern Mexican region of Texas to reestablish themselves and to find a more profitable future for their families. So it all kind of goes together. Now, before mass communication, of course, learning about provinces as distant as Texas for a lot of people and what it had to offer is not going to be an easy one. Interested Americans would have to find information however they could, like Dr. Torgett was talking about, those networks of newspapers and the like, same kind of thing. And for years, explorers had published the details of their journeys back and forth across the western wilderness, whether it be Lewis and Clark, Zebulon Pike, Freeman and Custis, et cetera. I've seen plenty of those in libraries. They're still very much available. And it's not until you really take a look in the early 1830s that you see something come out that's similar yet different for Texas, and that's going to be the work of, let's see if I can get this thing to work. Yay, there I did. Mary Austin Holley, and there she is. Mary Austin Holley, a 49-year-old widow who, partly at the request of her cousin Stephen F., and partly with her own financial well-being in mind, and that's something that's kind of going along with everything else. In the 1830s, she was writing stuff about Texas that was basically kind of an exploration narrative combined with an immigrant guide. Immigrants' guides were going to be very de rigueur, mid-19th century. If you want to figure out how to get to, say, Oregon country or Texas or what have you, you need to know where to go, how to get there, what things to bring. She was doing the exact same thing for Texas. Now, hers were not just to lure intended settlers, although since she is working with her cousin, that's going to be very much the case. They were also intended to provide very practical information for those who might settle in what to them was unknown territory. And so as she did all this, she put this all out there, tried to explain what Texas was like, what it looked like, what they could expect to find, but she did so, as she put it, in the hope of being useful. And that's the way she would phrase it. So in that way, Holley's work is both going to reflect and encourage a distinctly American take on immigration into Texas that would, in the long run, of course, kind of contribute to that independence from Mexico. So she was putting this stuff forward, but you can also learn a little bit about how she did this stuff by looking at her own background. Her writings in particular have a distinct romantic streak. And of course, when I'm talking about romantic, I'm not just thinking like Harlequin romantic, I mean like the Romantic movement. She was definitely a woman of her times, and you're going to see that. You can kind of see it, I think, in the picture. Honestly, she's got that faraway look in her eyes. But she had had that since childhood. And her biographer, Rebecca Smith Lee, talked about how, even as a child, she had had a preference for the outdoors. She and her husband, Horace, once she married, loved what they called the romantic scenery about them. And when others didn't seem to share that appreciation as much as she thought that they should, like with one friend in upstate New York, they were traveling. She said, "Oh, look at the beautiful scenery." Her friend couldn't have cared less. She didn't understand why they wouldn't. So that's going to carry over a little bit into her writings. So when Stephen Austin came to visit her and her brothers and talk about the beauties of Texas and the opportunities of Texas, I mean, that's going to intrigue her naturally, and you could definitely see that a little bit. So in her descriptions of Texas, Holley had a tendency to wax almost rhapsodic about the land and its aesthetic and all the parts of it. So she would describe it for her readers as a tract of surpassing beauty. For example, the northern reaches by the Red River, she said, were romantic, and the territory along the Brazos was unsurpassed for the beauty of its scenery. So for Americans who were, if you go further east, of course, you have more and more forested lands. She was trying to explain the idea of vast open fields of wildflowers, and it's kind of difficult to describe. As she put it, it said, "It is impossible to imagine the beauty of a Texas prairie when, in the vernal season, its rich, luxuriant herbage, adorned with its 1,000 flowers of every size and hue, seems to realize the vision of a terrestrial paradise." So I said, waxing rhapsodic, but you can kind of picture it. In a way, this is going to be for her, if we're talking about maps, a mental map. Lay all this stuff out, see what is there, explore from there. Now, that doesn't mean she always reveled in the glories of natural Texas. That's one thing that I thought was interesting about the quote from Stephen F. Austin about the richness of the land and the healthfulness of the climate and all of that. She would speak of these things in her work. Privately in her diary, she went in slightly different directions. So, for example, January 1838, she got caught in the middle of a blue norther. She was not so sure what to make of that. She found it discouraging, which I can see that. And not an agreeable thing to be caught out in, which I would agree that. Now, similarly, the summers around Bolivar, where her brother Henry was, could be, as she put it, dangerous to health due to the threat of miasmata. So you have to watch out for that sort of thing. Now, her brother also recognized this. This is one reason why she moved to Texas off and on. She would spend time, and she would go back to Louisville, Kentucky, where she spent a lot of time, New Orleans, and the like. But on the way back to Louisville once, her brother asked her to take his 6 children with her and get out of Texas for the summer. So she understood the potential risks of what you're dealing with. She also discovered, of course, the prevalence of things like mosquitoes, which she faithfully described in her book as a great annoyance to everyone. Worse, of course, is what she called the animalcule called the red bug, which is also known as the chigger, which she labeled as tormenting. I think that's a gross misunderstanding and understatement. I've walked through plenty of Texas grass, and I would say tormenting is the least of my concerns. But that's the way she tended to put it. Now, overall, though, she was more focused on the beauty of the region than its less pleasant characteristics. Even the potential dangers, such as prairie fires, it inflamed her imagination. She wrote once in her diary, "One can imagine it to be an eruption of Vesuvius. It is sublime." So this is how she was portraying this. And the embrace of that natural landscape is very indicative of the Romantic movement, both in Europe and the U.S. Hollingsworth reflects this. At the same time, though, her American interpretation of beauty is going to include a far more pragmatic perspective, and that's going to be beauty that includes utility. How can land be used? How can it be improved upon? And for material profit, which harkens back to the question of why Stephen F. Austin and his father Moses were trying to make plans to get out here. And you can see that in all sorts of work. Henry Nash Smith had that seminal work, Virgin Land, where he pointed out very clearly Americans saw as the most beautiful land that which had been turned into profitable, bountiful fields. And that's how they tended to see it. So while Holley's readers would have enjoyed the prosaic descriptions of the landscape, they also wanted to know how they could benefit from it. So Holley was aware of that, and Holley was already thinking about how she could benefit from it because, well, she had a life too. And from the beginning, she planned to provide a gleaming portrait of Texas to entice her audience into moving west. and it didn't hurt that she viewed it through the same opportunistic lens. Now, that wouldn't bother other Americans, but given her circumstances, it just made sense. For example, her husband Horace had died of yellow fever in New Orleans in 1827. She is now widowed. She was trying to find ways to provide security both for herself and her 2 children, especially her son, also named Horace. Her daughter eventually would get married. Horace stayed with her for the remainder of her life. He apparently tended to prefer being outdoors, working with his hands, than worrying about things like, say, schoolwork. And so as a result of that, and there's some conjecture as to what exactly that entailed, he pretty much lived based upon her largesse for the remainder of her life. And so she responded as any devoted parent would. You're going to do the best you can for them. But then she ends up dealing with Henry's 6 children on a regular basis, and you can see how this could be problematic, particularly as Henry was struggling with his own economic difficulties. So she expressed her hopes on how to take Texas and maybe use it for her own personal benefit, writing to her daughter Harriet when her daughter got married in different letters. And she described in detail her plans for publishing ventures that she was going to pursue. She had an idea for a couple of books. Now, this is going to be the front page of what she had in 1833, Texas, Observations, Historical, Geographical, and Descriptive in a series of letters. I love the way they used to title things. But her ideas were tentatively, the first book would be called A Visit to Texas, and then the second would be called Travels in Texas. That didn't exactly work out. But she was hoping to get, and this is exactly, $1,000 due to increasing interest in the region. And she wrote to her daughter, said, there's no doubt they'll have a run. And she urged her daughter not to worry about her security. She said, wait till I am as rich as I am meant to be. Once the profits came in, she could invest further in the land in Texas, which was far more secure to her mind. She said, I'll have a league for you, one for Horace, and one for myself with a good income besides. So land for her had more potential for profit than books could, although she did do reasonably well. But at one point, she ended up selling about 1,500 acres to get another $1,000 just to be able to meet the needs of her family. So land is, of course, critical. So for most Americans, they're not looking to write books to make a lot of money, but the profit would come more directly from the use of the land than its sale. The United States was a nation of farmers, and in an increasingly capitalistic society, farming is not just given a sense of freedom, but of great opportunity and promotion for yourself and your family. So personal freedom and economic freedom by the early 19th century are kind of 2 parts of the same whole. One historian, John Lawrence Larson, talks about it, talking about all it would take was a man to find a little piece of land, put his shoulder to the wheel, mind his personal habits, tend to his own business, and reap his just reward. The promised, many believed, of liberty and independence in the new American Republic. So this all is part and parcel of the same thing. So Holley would very carefully choose her words to describe Texas as a society where fortunes could be made or, because of the Panic of 1819, which has been discussed today, remade. So just as long as settlers were willing to invest the time and effort necessary to make the wilderness bloom, well, as she put it, the natural riches of this beautiful province have begun to be unfolded, its charms displayed to the eyes of admiring adventurers. It's all there for the taking. It's ready for you. As far as she was concerned, God himself had designed this land to delight the senses and enrich the pockets of those who were disposed to accept of its bounties. Now, it shows that there was a task to be done, and it certainly wasn't going to be easy. She said, though the land be literally flowing with milk and honey, yet the cows must be milked, and the honey must be gathered. Houses must be built and enclosures made. The deer must be hunted and the fish must be caught. On the frontier, what she was stressing is labor is to be performed. So fortunately, she thought Texas was designed for utility. There's our map. And you can kind of get an idea. We've seen this before, but it gives you an idea. This was the one that was in the first edition in 1833. No matter how beautiful the land, it wouldn't make a lick of difference if it were infertile. It would be completely useless for their purposes. So she spent a great deal of time kind of buttressing what her cousin Stephen F. had been doing just a few years prior, really elaborating on the agricultural and the commercial potential of the colony. For example, the area near Austin's colony and the Brazos, Colorado, and Guadalupe rivers. I think if I can get a picture. There you go, right about there. were, as they put it, it was waiting, as it were, to receive the plow. And it looked like land that reveled in almost perpetual summer, which to them was a good thing because of the planting seasons. I'm ready for fall. 2 to 3 different crops a year could emerge with a wide variety of produce for consumption and for sale. So that included both Texas cotton, which has been elaborated on more than I need to say here, and the potential for Texas sugar. She said she found the possibilities better in Texas than she found elsewhere, and the local grapes, as she put it, of the most exquisite flavor would make fantastic wine. And she put all of this into her books for people to think about ways that they could benefit as well. And so she emphasized the benefits of the land for commerce. Waterways promised great opportunities for trade, although she noted that what you would probably need is some good modern technology to dredge out those pesky sandbars. Then the town of Galveston, of course, she valued because she said it was one of the best locations on the Gulf between Pensacola and Veracruz for trade. On the coastal prairies, all you needed was a loaded wagon. You could drive it to the beach without obstruction, as she described it, making shipping far more accessible to people. And then not only could new roads, which were still being carved out for many people in the 1830s, they would benefit Texans, but soon, as she said, the railway will be the common road in use to speed up the process. It was all a bright, shining future. Now, up to this point, her immigrant guide would have familiar content for Americans curious about the frontier, its bounties. What differentiated her was her emphasis on the roles available there for women. Because in many ways, all the stuff we've talked about in terms of explorers like Pike or even Stephen F. Austin and others has been largely a masculine venture. She had already earned some criticism before her venture from friends who were worried that her scheme was, as they put it, too adventurous for a female. This didn't bother her. To her, it was critical that women understand what to expect in the new colony as their men, because, as she put it, it was immigrant mothers who would provide the comfort of every family and the general well-being of the infant colony. So husbands and fathers might focus on the larger aspects of the endeavor, she said, but what she downplayed as trivial circumstances, think the day-to-day aspects of life in Texas, provided women a means to some useful end. And so every settler, male or female, would have a critical role in adjusting to the new environment and making it work for them. So, for example, 1833, when her book came out, Texas had very few of the creature comforts that a lot of people back east were actually used to, and she did not sugarcoat that. She said if a housekeeper, as she put it, needed something specific for her family's benefit, they needed to be prepared, as she put it, to bring all indispensable articles for household use, together with as much common clothing, other clothing is not wanted, for themselves and their children as they conveniently can. Her emphasis on the need for useful clothing, not considered everyday or common, is striking. Now, there might come a time in the future where fancy dress might be better, but not yet. Now, ladies in particular, she said, should remember that in a new country, they cannot get things made at any moment, as in an old one, and that they will be sufficiently busy the first 2 years in arranging such things as they have without occupying themselves in obtaining more. Now, the only other counsel she really wanted to provide was, nothing for show and all for use. Now, when she says useful, I think it's interesting that what she considered for use included that she suggested that women should pack a few well-selected standard books to bring it along and supplement. Now, the author did also note the effects of frontier society on femininity. This is the time period of the cult of true womanhood, where you have that ideal starting to emerge of women being the feminine ideal. Now, life in the early 19th century is just uncertain, perhaps more so in Texas than elsewhere at that point, and women needed to consider the possibility of life on their own without their husbands. So she worked to try to be encouraging. She said, women have capacity for greatness, but they require occasions to bring it out. Many a wife in Texas has proved herself the better half, and many a widow's heart has prompted her to noble doing. As a widow, she would know. Not only did women exemplify Republican virtue and patriotism, but many individual women had proven themselves to be more strenuous than even they could believe. Some had even become expert hunters, and she made note of this. But while Holley's descriptions of fertility, prosperity and growth would have been appealing. She also recognized many Americans were very concerned about the security of a territory that's not under U.S. jurisdiction. From the beginning, Texas was multicultural in a way not experienced by contemporaries in quite the same way. What were potential immigrants going to make of that? Did a Texas under Mexican rule, for example, function differently than it would under American law? So the thing is, of course, immigration from the United States was already multicultural. As we've pointed out already today, slaves accompanied many white Southerners. Now, technically, the Mexican government disapproved very strongly of slavery. They made it illegal in 1829. However, due to arguments that slavery added to the prosperity of the territory, a lot of times allowances were made with what was called at the time permanent indentured servitude. So as a result, by 1835, you've got about 3,000 slaves or so living in Texas alongside Anglo planters. And many of Holley's readers would have considered slavery critical to any agricultural endeavor, particularly since many of them came from southern states. Holley, in contrast, was from Connecticut. And that's going to change the way she viewed things. She was sympathetic to the growing anti-slavery movement, and now she's coming to Texas. And she's not unfamiliar with slavery in Southern life. I mean, she had accompanied her husband to Lexington, Kentucky when he became president of Transylvania University. And the servants in their home there were actually leased slaves, which made her distinctly uncomfortable. But both she and Stephen, from what I can gather, recognized the low population in Texas meant it would be difficult to work the land to its fullest potential without additional help. Now, combine that with the discussion Dr. Torget put forward about this tenuous balance between trying to maintain the stability of the colony and maintaining the favor of the Mexican government and everything else. And then she brings in her own potential anti-slavery sentiments. The way she seems to have viewed it was that slavery was a temporary but necessary evil. Later on, she would talk about how the laws of Mexico were wonderful for eliminating what she called this worst of evils, but she was afraid that relying on slavery was going to become basically a prop to lean upon and might lead to greater dependence. And in fact, by the end of her cousin's life, it seemed to be that they were starting to recognize this was going to be slave country, so it would be Americanized enough to remain strong from the dangers of Mexico. But as for slavery itself, you don't see as much about that as you see other things. Maybe reflects her ambivalence in this a little bit, maybe not. When she does mention it, she tried to mitigate slave circumstances, tried to ease her own conscience in a way about the nature of life. Talking about how slaves were given more liberty in Texas than elsewhere. For example, being paid for some of their work, a chance to earn their own freedom, based on what little she saw of this. Now, it's hard to discern things from silence, obviously, but it seems to indicate that she hoped the situation would change over time, even if she may not have put much hope in it. But most would-be settlers were really concerned less with slavery and more with the potential of conflict with the local Indian tribes, such as the Comanche, who were becoming increasingly infamous, living at close proximity. Now, the U.S. is already caught in the middle of this, the potential removal of tribes from the Southeast, such as the Cherokee, many of whom were already in Texas since the 1820s, trying to get out of the United States, hoping for protection from the Mexican government. So the question is, could they live side by side? Are people considering Native Americans civilized? What does that look like? She dismissed a lot of the concerns. She basically looked at it for the variety of tribes and basically said, these all can be worked through. Tribes like the Cherokee, she said, had no problem with Americans showing up. She said they were respectful towards them, whatever that means. She called them the Tawakanese, so that's the Tawakani and the Tonkaways, were too civilized, she said, to cause problems. If they did, one way or the other, they're just too few in number, as far as she was concerned, to make a significant impact. But there were some that had already made a reputation, at least that was circulated, such as the Karankawa, who the perception had been for centuries there were rumors of cannibalism, that kind of thing. She said reports like that were greatly exaggerated. The best solution, she said, you be reasonable with people, they'll be reasonable and kind. That's simply how it works. Now, the Comanche were the ones that had the most concern because of their fabled ferocity, basically. And even she would note the problems the Comanche and the Spanish had had and Mexicans had had in and around San Antonio de Béjar. but she insisted that the Comanche were hospitable people overall if treated respectfully. Now, what she meant by this, she did not elaborate. Again, at the very least, she said the Comanche seemed to prefer Americans to Mexicans anyway, since it seems like they had a much more antagonistic history with Mexico to be based upon. Now, while Holley's kind of circumspect approach towards the Comanche could leave readers kind of unsettled, her discussions of Tejanos in the region is far more specific, although she would change her opinion drastically between 1833 and 1836 when another edition came out that became much more interesting. That one was done in the thick of the Texas Revolution, and you can kind of see where we're going. Originally, she portrayed a very benevolent Mexican government, willing and eager to work with American settlers. And probably her brother's experiences, her cousin's experiences probably informed this somewhat, but she also recounted a time where, as she was coming in, they asked her for her passport. She couldn't find it. And it turned out the soldier who was asking gave her enough grace to take her at her word and say, okay, you're fine, you can go on through. And she appreciated that deeply. But like the impresarios had, she chose to emphasize the common humanity, the good intentions of this government that was otherwise foreign to American experience. But she also noticed, these intentions had an uncertain future due to low population and what she would call political difficulties, thinking about things like that were discussed, like the law of April 6th of 1830, the corresponding conventions in 1832, 1833, pleading for better opportunities for American settlers. What she did say was, if Texas should hereafter become the victim of foreign domination or the theater of domestic oppression, it would not be the first instance of an Eden converted into abode of sorrow and wretchedness by the falling of man. Only time would tell. Now, between 1833 and 1836, some of her concerns were, yes, realized, and by the time she updated her work, you have Texans, both Anglo and Tejano, battling against Mexican forces, partly in an attempt to regain some of the rights lost when the Constitution of 1824 was dissolved. And this is going to change her perspective on how Texas should function and how the Mexican government functioned. Now it was deemed tyrannical, and then Hispanics, generally speaking, are also going to be targeted as well. Now, she recognized that the number of Tejanos in the region was small. She estimated about 10% of the 50,000 or so inhabitants were Tejano by her own count. She indicated that their negative influence far outweighed their presence. The Mexican soldiers fighting against the revolutionaries were, as she put it, more brutal and more cowardly than the counterparts. That's how she insisted on it. She didn't say anything about the Tejanos fighting in the revolution alongside people like Austin, Travis, what have you, but that's beside the point. As for other Tejanos that she's speaking about just generally, she chose to see the worst in them by 1836, labeling them ignorant and degraded, as well as indolent, immoral, superstitious, and just kind of kept going. And she would channel this fervor into efforts to raise support for the Texans embroiled in war, hence the next edition. Most of the stuff was the same. This is very different. She focused much more on the Texas Revolution, how it occurred, how its participants would show valor in the face of cruelty and barbarism. Texans struggled to establish a reasonable form of civilization. She suggested to cast off Mexican centralism. And additionally, while restricting Protestantism originally, she thought would lead to fewer sectarian squabbles, and she was supportive of that, establishing Roman Catholicism, it provided another reason for revolution as far as she was concerned. And her book then included several documents kind of added as appendices towards the end, things such as the Declaration of Taking Up Arms, the Texas Declaration of Independence, and a speech by her cousin Stephen F. to the women of Lexington, Kentucky, in an attempt to raise financial and moral support, which she was also deeply involved. Because in April 1836, the revolution was drawing to a faster close than even she could have expected. That was when she was starting to publish back in the United States, again, for the cause of Texas, but in the Lexington Gazette and Intelligencer, asking the women of the city to labor for the cause. What she wrote was, "These ladies who are disposed to devote a portion of their time and their needles to the holy cause of Texas will please to call at the house of the subscriber, her, where may be found materials for this sacred charity." So as a result of this, she and other women so disposed helped make 18 shirts, 24 handkerchiefs, 6 collars, and a flag. All these to be sent off to her cousin to help boost morale. And of course, by that point, I mean, the war was basically over. Such resources would probably have been more useful in a new republic rather than establishing independence. But she did maintain her interest in Texas, although it's interesting that for all her time emphasizing Texas, she never settled there long term, even after the revolution was over. She maintained her interests with some concerns. By 1836, there was a financial panic wreaking havoc in the United States. It had impacted the republic just as well, especially in land sales. And she told this to her daughter. She said, real estate falling fast here. Had I been here 2 months sooner, she got there as fast as she could, I could have sold to much greater advantage. So she was hurting along with a lot of people back east. But she still thought land in Texas would be safer for any potential investor than anything east of it. Everybody tells me to hold on, sell what's only necessary, she said. And that must have been nerve-wracking for somebody trying to take care of, by that point, an adult son and her nieces and nephews and what have you. But she seemed to maintain her faith in the land, which she had supported so fervently in this immigrant guide. Now, by the time she died, 1846, also of yellow fever, Texas was the newest addition to the Union. She had watched the region grow from thinly populated Mexican frontier to annexed state. And it must have occurred to her that this growth and change, they were, even if only in part, due to her involvement alongside that of her cousin. But the narrative she published, her work on Texas's behalf, it did make the region in many ways more visible, more understandable, and more accessible to a distant audience, as well as far more appealing. So these initial literary forays that you see with her into foreign territory would open the doors to further immigration for decades to come. Thank you.
Take some questions now. Where's the microphone?
I have no idea.
How did her cousin feel about her book that she wrote?
I think they were working pretty closely in cahoots. In fact, there is a strong rumor, substantiated by some scholarship, that they might have been more than just friends. After the death of her husband, they were first cousins. That was not unheard of. But I joked with my husband, I had this feeling I was going to be saying, like, me and Mrs. Holley got a thing going on. But I think he was interested in kind of having any support he could get. I mean, as it has been mentioned already today, he was trying to sell the land as much as he could, maybe through map making and the like. She's adding her own literary talents. They talked about this stuff a lot. And so a lot of this was done in concert. Yes.
You use the term Tejano.
Yes.
What would be your definition of a Tejano, and when was it formulated in the Southwest?
Now, in terms of when it was formulated, honestly, I couldn't tell you, but what I'm referring to is specifically those people of Hispanic origins who were in the region that would eventually become Texas, kind of that northern part of Coahuila y Texas. That's how I tend to personally refer to it. I'm sure there's probably a much more established definition, but that's the one I've typically heard, and that's the one I tend to use with my students. Yeah, he's somebody of Hispanic origin. So originally, yes, they're Mexican citizens, as are technically the Americans coming in. They're supposed to take on Mexican citizenship. They're supposed to adhere to the Roman Catholic faith, swear an oath of loyalty, both to Mexico and to the state of Coahuila y Texas. So they're all in the same boat. It's just their heritage is a little bit different, but they're basically facing the same direction in many ways. Lorenzo de Zavala is a pretty good example. Eventually would become the first vice president of Texas. He started off as an impresario.
Right here.
Oh,
Have you done any studies about when Stephen F. Austin was imprisoned in Mexico? Does she have any writings during that time?
Short answer is no. I want to say that's going to be more like early 1820s, right? Or are you talking about closer to 1835, 1830? She didn't. I have not seen much about. I think she referred to it when there's a history of the revolution that I believe she touches upon it. She's tried very hard to remain as objective as possible, except in her effusive language where landscape is concerned. There would probably be good reason for that, especially since they're related. But yeah, I think she did refer to it. And then once he was able to be freed, he was able to kind of return the favor and go up to Lexington and kind of champion the cause there. I'm sure she arranged a lot of that. So it's a matter of trying to stay objective in a subjective crisis, I guess. There are very bright lights up here, so if somebody's waving, I can't see. Okay, thank you.
You had characterized her view of slavery as temporary but necessary evil. Did you come across any research indicating her having correspondence with Stephen F. Austin or any other leadership of that time period expressing those opinions?
What I have seen from her papers does not include any letters that deal with that sort of thing. Typically, what I saw were things that were going to be more in her own diary and touched upon in the narrative, the immigrant guide. And she kept it pretty low-key, but the impression I get from just that bit of information is that she did not like it, but she saw it as kind of one of those things that had to be done. And then, what you going to do? So, you're welcome. Yes. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah, I wondered how she marketed her book. Was she marketing it to people on the East Coast? Because I'm trying to compare her with, did she predate Jacob de Cordova and his Immigrant's Guide to Texas? Or he marketed to people from mostly to England and Germany, and he went over there and brought people. Now, did she market to people on the East Coast of the U.S. to go to Texas? Is that what happened? Or?
Yes, because the publishing house that she used, I believe, was originally based out of Lexington, Kentucky, where she had been, and they would be points east. And so it's primarily aimed at American citizens and based out of there. So, yes. You're welcome.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.